I'll just wait a second till these last few people take their seats. So, welcome to the first of two public lectures from our Critical Studies Fellow, Alpesh Patel. Now, the Critical Studies program here at Cranbrook is really the cornerstone of our academic program, which is run out of the Dean's office, it's not run out of the Director's office, and is really run by Trish. And each year we select a fellow through a very rigorous search process, and I want to thank our search committee and Trish and those involved really in finding Alpesh to be here this semester. It's a real honor that we have him on campus. Like I say, tonight is the first of one of two public lectures, and really the program is about you engaging with him and him engaging with you throughout the course of the semester. Now, as a student here, you have to be really self-motivated, as many of you are probably finding out, to be a student here at Cranbrook. It was the same way when I was here as a student. When you really engage in the program, you get a lot out of it. And so for the Critical Studies Fellow, it's really important that you engage with him. He goes to your studio, gives crits, and it's important that you attend the readings that Alpesh sets. So I really want to encourage you all to get a lot out of our visitor and work him to death and something like that. So anyway, I'm going to leave the formal introduction to, that didn't sound quite right, but leave our formal introduction. I mean, I'm actually, no, I'm not going there. Anyway, I'd like to have Trish come up and do the formal introduction. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. By now, most of you know our speaker for this evening. He has visited many of your departments already. You've been signing up for our discussion groups that start tomorrow, and I know that he's even done a few reading groups with some of you guys, so please, like Chris said, invite him. For those of you that may not know our speaker for tonight, I will introduce him. Alpesh Patel is an assistant professor. Thank you for adding this. This is really nice. Contemporary Art and Theory and director of the MFA program in the Visual Arts at Florida International University in Miami. His art criticism, curating, and art historical scholarship reflects his queer, anti-racist, and transnational approach to contemporary art. Patel has contributed to journals and helped edit books on queer and haptic brown Atlantic, polemic museum viewing practices, and failed decolonial spectacles. Spectacles, I think, I wrote a note for myself. You need to define spectacles for us, I think. He is a frequent contributor to Hyperallergic, Art Forum, Art in America, and Freeze. As a curator, he helped establish FIU's Miami Beach Urban Studios, where he organized women and many other solo exhibitions. In 2007, he produced the exhibition Mixing It Up, Queering Curry Mile and Currying Canal Street in Manchester, England. And in 2017, he is publishing the monograph Productive Failure, Writing Transnational South Asian Art Histories. While here at Cranbrook, Patel will share his research on how globalization tends to overlook how images function within a specific time and space. His lectures will scale down the global to the local and the regional transregional to examine the production and circulation and consumption of contemporary art and design. Throughout the fall semester, Patel will help you to situate your work both theoretically, nationally, and globally, as well as in the context of contemporary identity politics. It has already been such a pleasure to have you here on campus with us. So let's get started. Please help me welcome Alpesh Patel.
All right, well, good evening, everyone. I just want to start by going over two themes that undergird this lecture and the next lecture on November 7th, so you get a sense of sort of the overall conceptual framework for the talks before we sort of go into the specific case studies for today. So the title, Artistic Practice as Theory and as Entangled with the World. So the first thing I'm really interested in doing is kind of looking at this notion of practice and theory. And as a director of an MFA program and also as a contemporary art historian and theorist, I've really been kind of interrogating what that actually means, and to sort of begin to even thinking about these two terms. I went to the Oxford English Dictionary to kind of look up what they actually wrote these things were, and of course, it wasn't very useful. So theory is the conceptual basis of a subject or area of study contrasted with practice, okay? And practice, application, or use of an idea, belief, or method as opposed to the theory or principles of it. Okay, so I think there's just a couple things I want to mention here. One is that I feel like practice is something that's generally used to describe art making. And I would hardly think any of you make art to apply any kind of idea or theory, but rather you make art to kind of investigate an issue, the complexity of which you could kind of do through materials, let's say. So in that sense, your work is very theoretical. You're just doing it in ways that are quite different. It's not language-based often. It's often material and corporeal. So this sort of tension between theory and practice is going to be in both of the lectures. So keep that sort of in mind. All right, the second part of the title, Entangled with the World, is the other sort of major theme, and I'll be exploring how sort of the visual culture broadly defined is produced and consumed in the world. And today, I want to think through how site-specific works are produced and consumed specifically through what we might provisionally call the local, which is supposedly the obverse of global. I say supposedly because my case studies are conceits to underscore how the local is always already global and transnational. I'll be drawing a lot on Martinican poet and theorist Edward Glissant's writings, particularly his book Poetics of Relation. It was published by University of Michigan Press in English in 1997, but it was originally written in French in 1990, so it's been around for a while. There's been light engagement with his ideas in the art world, with the exception of curator and critic Okwi Enwezor's 2002 Documenta, which is an exhibition which takes place every 5 years and which originated after World War II as a way for Germany to reframe itself. Okay, so there are three concepts that I'll interlace into each of my case studies, but not necessarily in equal measure: entanglement, globality, and opacity. So I just want to quickly define these terms before actually maybe thinking about how they operate in different situations. So Glissant bases his idea of entanglement, which he writes is where the world is headed, if it is not there already, on the site of the Caribbean, and its specific history of being a shared space in which colonialists lived with slaves, indentured servants, and their descendants. Cultural expression cannot be so easily disaggregated into components in such a space. Moreover, Glissant writes that entanglement is something which can refer to a broader set of socio-cultural processes outside of the Caribbean. So today I'll focus on how site-specific artworks engender a variety of entanglements to the past and present across national borders and other categories of identity such as gender, sexuality, and race, with the space in which they are installed. And again, when this was originally written, it was very much about the Caribbean and the unique situation there, and this idea that there's no way to kind of separate, let's say, the language there into different components. It's just way too entangled. And Glissant's saying that actually this is kind of a metaphor. We can kind of use this to describe other processes outside of the Caribbean. And there are scholars that have different views on this. I think today I'm really interested in kind of thinking how it might be a way we can kind of look at something outside of the Caribbean. All right, so Glissant uses the word globality instead of globalization, which I think is really important to kind of just quickly foreground. So he notes that globality is composed of both the multiple and one as inextricable. So while these histories are multiple, they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. And following Glissant's logic, strands of the multiple often intertwine and overlap and thereby cohere collectively around but never quite approximate the one. That's very abstract, I know, and I hope to make that a little bit more concrete. But for the moment, I'll say one way of thinking about this is that I could say that we all identify with Cranbrook at the moment. We're all here, and that's one identification. But that doesn't define many parts of me, right? Just one part. So Glissant is kind of saying that in the kind of globality that he envisions, I can be both part of Cranbrook and be lots of other things too. And this is something that generally doesn't happen. You often get kind of boxed into a frame. So he's interested in you being able to maintain your autonomy, which gets to sort of the last concept there, opacity, which is kind of my favorite because it really makes you rethink how you look at things. He writes that in the West, there's this kind of interest in being transparent and visible. Let's even talk about coming out, right? Or in France, where there's an interest in kind of, deveiling people because somehow once you do that, you're going to know everything. So he has a different kind of notion, which is this possibility to be opaque. And that is not to mean like you're obscure, but that you might not reveal all of yourself all of the time. And you may not even know all of yourself all the time. So this is a very interesting kind of way of looking about how we connect with this idea of globalization, that we could maintain autonomy. We don't have to reveal all of ourselves, which often is the way the West has operated, especially when they subjugate other cultures. It is about sort of transparency and visibility. All right, so these three terms I'm going to think about in the context of three artworks, public artworks. One of them is cited in Manchester, England. The work is titled Sphere Dreams and was produced in 2006. The second is the work Płot Nienawiści, which is Polish for Fence of Hatred, which was produced last year in 2015 by Hubert Cherrypak. And the third work cited in New York City, in Brooklyn, is Subtlety by Kara Walker from 2014. So all these different three sites I'm going to try to connect together and use these concepts to do that. Now, sort of before moving forward, I want to mention a couple of things. One is that it isn't an accident that I've chosen these sites. I have a very kind of specific relationship to them. They're all places that I've lived for a good amount of time. In Manchester, I did my graduate work there from 2005 to 2008, and the work of art I will discuss, I was sort of intimately involved with in the production on some level. In Warsaw, I was there for 6 months, so there is this connection there. And in Brooklyn, I lived actually next to the Domino Sugar Factory, in which Kara Walker's work actually is cited for about 5 years after school. So I bring that up, A, to be transparent and let you know that, but also to kind of talk about the fact that most art historians, when they're writing histories, they often kind of veil their interest or their subjectivities. They try to write something that appears objective. And here, by telling you my connections, I'm right away telling you it's very subjective. By doing that, I don't want to say that there isn't something interesting about putting the three of these together. And I want to talk a bit about that. Most histories, when they're written, I'm kind of generalizing, but they often get kind of regionalized. So Piotr Piotrowski, who's an art historian who was located in Poland, writes a lot about how Eastern Europe was the other in Europe. When people talk about Europe, they're talking about Spain and France. They're not talking about Poland or Latvia or Lithuania. And what that often did is kind of box practices in. So these practices, artistic practices happening in that part of the world, never really left it. They weren't kind of put into dialogue with things happening in other places. Part of this was obviously because of the kind of the social situation in those spaces, but another is kind of just a conceit of art history, which tends to favor Euro-America. At the expense of a lot of other locations. So this is an intervention in that. There's another intervention. I'm using cities, with the exception of New York, that aren't necessarily brought up either. When we think of projects that might be looking at transnational politics, they tend to follow global capital. That is, we're talking about London, or New York, these kind of big places, but other cities kind of get left out of the equation. So that's one intervention I'm making as well. So on the one hand, this is a very sort of subjective presentation. On another, I'm really trying to intervene in the way art histories are written. Okay, so the first of three case studies. Manchester is often known as the world's first industrialized city. It's more recently known actually in the post-2000 period as the commercial epicenter of gay life in the northwest of England. And this really happened after Queer as Folk, a series that was developed in the UK, really took off. That series was based on the gay village in Canal Street in Manchester. Manchester was where the first sort of Euro Pride happened in the UK. So it has this pride of place. And actually the city uses it a lot in its marketing of the city as cosmopolitan, which in of itself is a quite interesting and unique thing. Canal Street is the sort of epicenter of the gay village, and it's next to a canal, hence its name. And I just want to show you one or two shots here before I launch into a discussion of the work Sphere Dreams, which was strategically situated next to Canal Street in Sackville Park in 2006 for a few hours as part of that year's Queer Up North, a Manchester-based annual international arts festival dedicated to promoting queer arts and culture in the northwest of England. It's actually no longer around, unfortunately. So in late 2005, Sphere put out a call for women of South Asian descent from the northwest of England who identify as queer to share their dreams, hopes, and fears. Poetry written by one of the participants of Sphere about the many responses became sort of the foundation of the installation you're looking at now, which includes 13 beds, all of which are placed in a circle. And they're meant to provide a counter narrative to the gay, white, and male space of Canal Street. So pastiche and parody are two modes through which the beds question the stability of queer and South Asian as identifications. For instance, the headboard of one of the beds in Sphere Dreams has been replaced with a girl's bathroom door from a queer bar or club. This is the sort of front of it. While the bedspread and pillow of another is composed of a patchwork of clothing items such as jeans, a choli, or a short-sleeve blouse, a skirt, and a golden-colored salwar kameez. The pastiche, or the contiguity of the bathroom door with these traditional South Asian clothes, not only highlighted sort of the invisibility of South Asian women on Canal Street, but begins to question what's normative to begin with in the first place, which I think is kind of the exciting possibility of using pastiche and parody. I'm just going to walk through a couple of these beds because they're so interesting. So one of the beds was covered with plush comforters and sheets that molded to the contours of the subject who happened to be enveloped within them, allowing each subject who lay on the bed to leave an imprint of her or his body and creating sort of a complex, ever-shifting topography of embodied hills, valleys, or clouds. The illusion of clouds was also signaled by the silver ink used to write words such as security, love, dream, safety, as you see up here, and peace on the sheets in both English and in Urdu. So light and airy, the bed depicted sort of the metaphorical and literal silver lining in every cloud, giving it a utopian quality or an escapist feeling. Another bed in which a tree was sort of planted and covered in a verdant fitted sheet was similarly life-affirming in its suggestion of the bed as a celebratory site of fertility. Other beds were much more confrontational, such as this stark black vinyl-clad minimalist mattress that's sort of warped into what appears to be a body, and the waist of which is forcibly formed by a surgical bandage wrapped around its center. Through a grated opening on the side of the platform of that bed, another body is present, covered by a shroud-like white sheet. And you might say again, like this bed implicitly highlights the metaphoric difficulties and constraints of navigating Canal Street as a queer, female, and South Asian subject. Another bed included bejeweled flesh-like materials resembling footprints that were interspersed with splashes of red paint, suggests the ritual of new Indian brides dipping the soles of their feet in red dye to really mark their first entry into their new homes. And these beds underscore the presumptive heteronormativity of this aforementioned ritual in the context of this project, which would exclude lesbians, right, from that kind of practice. In a similar way, women in India are often called upon to put together what is present here, a Rangoli floor design composed of flowers, incense, rice, and powdered chalk. once again, sort of, kind of intervening in the heteronormativity that is embedded within that practice. It's worth noting, though, the installation wasn't exclusively connected to Hinduism. I think that's a really important point. Another bed sort of incorporated depictions of Christ on the cross, which you kind of see right here, barely can see it. And also the Om symbol, which is utilized in not only Hindu but Jain and Buddhist faiths, sort of underscoring the many faiths connected to a queer South Asian female subjectivity. There's also flags on here of India, Australia, and the United Kingdom, which represent complex connections these women have to various nations, whether by birth, residence, or perhaps even tourism. So when we, going back to one of the concepts I mentioned, globality, and the multiple and the one, this is like a really fantastic way to kind of, I think, articulate that. You've got here 13 beds, all of which are very different, and they exist together, right, as one, a queer South Asian sort of feminist intervention along Canal Street, but you can't reduce any of the beds to just a queer South Asian female subjectivity. It's much more than that, right, as you're seeing with all these faiths, and that there's no way to kind of classify them so simply. So this is this idea of the multiple existing with the one. I think it's really a brilliant example of that particular concept. So after seeing that project, which was so amazing for me, I learned a lot from it. One thing it really made clear was that I needed to think about gender and other kinds of categories as they intersect with queer and South Asian, which at that time were my most sort of important areas of interest. It also brought up the importance of the body. All those works, you could get intertwined with literally by being a part of them, but they also were synesthetic. They included poetry being piped up from under the beds. They had the incense. It used almost every sort of sense except for taste, right? So the sense that we have to think about that aspect. And perhaps the most important aspect for me was kind of thinking about space and sight and how that kind of changes how we explore and think about identification. The Canal Street had one specific kind of resonance for that project, and I was very interested in thinking about how the project would read in another kind of space. I've given this Google map to give you a sense of where I'm going here. This is the gay village in Manchester, and in between the gay, going down this blue line, we're going down what's called the Oxford Road Cultural Corridor. It includes the University of Manchester, which is the largest university in the United Kingdom, Manchester Metropolitan University, and also a music school. And eventually you end up at what's called Curry Mile. So they're about a 20-minute bus ride apart. And of course, given my specific interest in queer South Asian identity, I'm very much kind of thinking about these two spaces. So I worked with Sphere to kind of reimagine or resituate these beds in different sites, one of which was Curry Mile. So Curry Mile, formed in the 50s and 60s as a result of sort of the migration patterns of South Asians. And during the 60s and 70s and the early 80s, there's very much a space for South Asians, not only in terms of the ownership, but the clientele. As you get to the post-2000 period, that changes quite a bit. A number of the South Asians actually have left. The clientele is actually most of the students at the University of Manchester, and so it's very different in that sense. And I bring that up because the content of these restaurants, the way in which they sort of imagine themselves with their paintings, et cetera, kind of careen into a commodity spectacle when you kind of take away this other context. And it's a spectacle which I can't argue in detail today, but I do someplace else, that I argue is sort of patriarchal, and it's also sort of exotic and primitive. So this is the kind of space that's produced. If Canal Street's a gay, white, and male space, then you might say that Curry Mile is this, again, patriarchal, exotic, and primitive space. So within that, again, these women with their queer subjectivities are intervening, but in a very different kind of modality, right? And especially within the context of sort of British colonialism as well, which this is all entangled with on some level. It's a couple couple of shots. It's often called like a neon shrine to Curry, the father, yeah. Another interest of mine in working with Sphere on reciting these beds is that often projects that deal with identity get, again, condensed into these very clunky ideas of identity, of what it is, that other kinds of readings seem to be less possible. And I was very interested in kind of taking these beds, putting them in some of the museums that were on the Oxford Road Cultural Corridor to kind of allow them to be part of other narratives that didn't necessarily deal with the queer South Asian sort of element right away. So the Whitworth Art Gallery, the shot of which I'm showing you here, which is located on the Oxford Cultural Corridor, in about like a 7-minute walk to Curry Mile, had an exhibition going on called The Figure. And it was based largely on, or only on, material that they had in their collection at the time. I mean, it's not surprising that most of the work that was shown, given it's a collection show, were done by white males, right? And they were of usually nude white women as well. So in that sense, having this project by Sphere in this context, radically kind of shifts the story in a lot of ways, because you've got a woman controlling her own body in terms of how she's presenting herself. I just want to show you a few of these other sort of artworks here before I show you the work that was in the museum. Now, it was very different also in terms of the fact that it was contemporary, right? All the other works were historical, and so they're largely paintings and drawings. So it stood out in that sense too. And actually, what you see here is sort of a ghostly figure emerging from what is supposed to be kind of a table full of file folders. And it comes from a woman who works in corporate Britain and wanted to kind of, put together a bed that would show her sort of anxiety of being in these spaces that largely worked against her in a lot of different ways. All right, this was a new work that was produced as part of that Mixing It Up project. It's a mural that was put in a space called Corner House on their ground floor. And Corner House overlooks a very busy area of the Oxford Road Cultural Corridor. It's closer to the gay village. And what was great is that the mural was incredibly visible to lots of people, since the ground floor was completely clear and was only full of windows. And the mural itself is very kind of loud and bright. It's hard not to kind of see it. But what's interesting about this is that what you'll see, within the mural is serial repetitions of silhouettes of the woman in Sphere. Now, kind of going back to that concept of opacity again, right? About how it's important to kind of be able to maintain your autonomy and not have to necessarily be visible at all times. This is, I think, a really fantastic example of that, where these women actually are quite visible in terms of how the mural is functioning, but they're able to maintain part of themselves. They're not telling you everything about them. And when I first sort of saw this work and I wrote about it, I had a very different take on it because I wasn't looking at it through Glissant's sort of notions. I was thinking, okay, I have to spin this silhouette in a way that's productive because their whole project is about visibility and making themselves present, and then here they have these silhouettes, right? It seems like it might be working against some of what they're doing. So now I have a very different kind of, I think, understanding what this might mean. And again, this idea of not necessarily being completely visible or showing all of yourself, or that all of yourself could be just queer, South Asian, and female, was very important. So the next work I want to talk about is in Warsaw, Poland, and just in case you don't know where Poland is, it's right here next to Germany. And unfortunately, I can't go into sort of deep histories of any of these cities. I'm giving kind of light histories that are specific in terms of the works. But work with me here as I try to do this. The work I want to look at is Hubert Cherrypok's Płot Nienawiści, The Fence of Hatred, that was installed in the Marano district in Warsaw, Poland in 2015. It was a 15 feet long steel fence. It was installed in a park there, and it was dedicated to hate speech. The person who put this together, the artist, was very interested sort of intervening in the ways in which there was like a lot of graffiti that was emerging, especially in connection to football or soccer, in Poland, that used a lot of anti-Semitic language or visuality. So here's one example, sort of the graffiti Jebak Zidov, which is fuck the Jews. So this kind of imagery is kind of appearing, and the artist wanted people to kind of, slow down and think about it, which is to say not just walk past it, which is what often happens with a lot of graffiti there. So to kind of allow that to happen, he created this fence, right, which has the words of a lot of different hate speech in it, but it's twisted in such a way that you can't actually read it right away. You have to kind of spend some time with it. So it slows you down and maybe allows you to pay attention to what's there. It's made out of steel, and I think there's something interesting in there too about it pointing to the gravity of the messages, even though they're perhaps based on graffiti, which is ephemeral. And there are a lot of anti-Semitic and anti-Gypsy phrases on there. They're all in Polish, so I won't sort of go into all of them. But there's also anti-Semitic statements that are always already gendered too. I want to make clear, like, sort of that the anti-Semitism is always gendered and homophobic as well. Those things are tied together. So one of the words in here is kurva or whore. So you see how these kinds of things kind of get interconnected, and you can't kind of disentangle them in some way. Kind of issues of sexuality, race here with gender. The only phrase in here that's not in Polish, and it's interesting, is put in, is a German phrase. Let's see, Jude Rauhaus. And, it made me think, first of all, that the fact that it's a German phrase more specifically connects it to the Holocaust. And Poland was in a situation, especially, Warsaw had a huge ghetto, one of the biggest, or perhaps the biggest at that time. And these are the gates to Auschwitz that the work that Hubert has put together kind of reminds me of, just because it is also made out of steel and there's also text in it. But here the text is quite different. It's kind of, ironically about work making you free. So there's these kind of interesting entanglements to the past, right, as well as the current moment and the way these sort of graffiti is being used. And to give a little bit more detail about the football hooliganism, there are a number of intense rivalries within cities there, especially in Krakow and in Łódź in Poland. So these cities have soccer teams that go back to the early 1900s. And in Krakow in particular, there are two teams, one of which at that time contained or had a lot of Jewish members, another one that did not. So at the time, provisionally, they were often called Jude Gang for Jewish gang and anti-Jude Gang for the other sort of soccer camp that didn't have as many Jewish players. So there's a lot of writing about how the tagging and the graffiti has to be seen in that context. And I would say, though, that unfortunately for that kind of reading, that these signifiers are much too powerful to kind of be held so closely to the local. It's not enough, even though there actually also are sort of directors of NGOs, of Jewish philanthropic organizations that also talk a lot about the fact that, these signifiers are not meant in any way to be anti-Semitic. There are these football teams really kind of fighting against each other. But I think it cannot be taken so lightly, and I don't think the artist is either, which is why he's kind of created this work. Now, I mentioned the work was located in the Marano district, right in the park there. The Marano district is where the Polish ghetto was. So you'll see this in many different parts of the Marano district. It indicates where the wall actually stood, so it's something you can't forget. So in that sense, too, the work is very connected to what was happening post-World War II. After a week of the fence being up and kind of proved the artist's point, there was a sort of graffiti that was put over the work, and it was anti-Semitic. This sort of means away with a chutzpah, using the Yiddish term for audacity. So, you know, this kind of just proves, again, like the artist's point about the importance of kind of thinking about how this language works. What I think is also quite fascinating is that phrases like Polska dwa Polaków, which is also in the fence, is something that is used not only as a historical reference to World War II, but it's used in anti-refugee rallies now in Poland. So there's this kind of interesting connection to other kinds of issues. And I think that the rise of the sort of anti-Semitic sort of tagging is very connected also to this rise of lack of interest in refugees. I mean, this is about there being no globality, right? There is no multiple in the one here. The one is pure, and it doesn't include hardly anything. I'm not sure what it includes on some level. There's one other bit of entanglement that I thought was worth pointing out, which I think is very interesting. But after 2004, when Poland became part of the EU, a lot of Poles moved to England. Many of them went to Manchester and took the homes that South Asians had, let's say, in the Curry Mile area, which in itself is another kind of interesting twist. And according to the UK migration statistics, Poland now overtakes India as the number one country of origin in England. So they have become sort of the new minority. And as you probably have heard, there's lots of sort of rhetoric about the Poles leaving the UK, especially after Brexit. So all of these issues, you know, sort of from the past and present that I'm kind of discussing, I think are an interesting knot that the work has embedded within its forms. Not necessarily always so explicitly, but they do lead to all of these connections, I think. Okay, the third work I'm going to talk about is in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, and this is a shot of the waterfront in Williamsburg, a shot of the Brooklyn, shot of the Domino Sugar Factory that's there, which is now recently being turned into a high-rise. The only thing that remains is this brick structure here. The rest of it has been sort of demolished. But before it was demolished, there was an artwork that was put in it that it was commissioned actually by the owners of the sugar factory. And I'm going to leave aside sort of the deconstruction of the commissioning of the work for a second and talk about more generative readings, which I think is maybe much more interesting to me. So just a bit of history of this factory. When it opened, it was the world's largest sugar factory. And by the 1890s, it was producing half of the US's sugar. And it closed in 2004, during the time that I was living near there. Now, in its earliest days, most of the sugar arriving at the refinery was harvested by slaves. And in one way, you can say that Kara Walker's work is a critique of the Caribbean sugar plantation model and the transatlantic slave trade, as well as the indentured servitude of South Asians that sustained them. And we can connect all of this back to the kind of trades in textiles and spices as well that happened in Manchester on some level too. All right, Kara Walker always has very kind of long poetic titles, and the title actually, I think, bears the meaning that I've just told you, the kind of interest in her in bringing attention to the ways in which the material actually arrived at the refinery. The title, A Subtlety or the Marvelous Sugar Baby, a homage to the unpaid and overworked artisans who have refined our sweet taste from the cane fields to the kitchens of the New World on the occasion of the demolition of the Domino Sugar Refining Plant in 2014. This is, was stenciled outside of the factory. The centerpiece of the work is a 35-foot tall, 75-foot long figure that appears to be half mammy, half sphinx. And the vast blocks of polystyrene foam that make it up are covered and coated in about 30 tons of sugar that's also laced with poison to keep the rats away, which is why they told people not to lick the sugar, but people did it anyway. Now, the work is incredibly sexualized, hyper-sexualized, you might say. And, right, you sort of have this top half that is sort of the nurturing figure, and the bottom half there's this sort of the sexualized figure. Again, this is the colonial edict of sexualizing the colonial females and emasculating the colonial males in the process. But I like to kind of think that there is this possibility of reading this work through this notion of opacity that I mentioned here, because the Sphinx has what? A body of a lion with the head of a king or a god. So we have to think of this mammy figurehead as the equivalent of a king or god. So it projects a kind of strength, right? But also inscrutability, right? The Sphinx is not something easily read. So I feel like, right, this work, even though it is quite sexually explicit, it doesn't give you everything. There's something there in the Sphinx that's being held back. And it's that kind of, I think, opacity, which I find quite interesting. So the work and her status as sort of mammy was accentuated by a smattering of cherubic figures made from brown sugar and poured in baskets of sucrose. And these figures really alternatively conjure blackamoor figurines, which I won't go into in some details, but they were very popular in Europe and incredibly racist. To give you a sense of how tall these figures were. So what I find quite fascinating is that a lot of the writing on the work focuses on the historical connections to the transatlantic slave trade, as they should. It's a very important part of the piece. But there's not a lot of discussion of the workers that were in the factory here in the US. And I'm just starting to kind of look into that information, but it's not lost on me that, for instance, Williamsburg is next to Greenpoint, which has the second largest Polish population in the United States. There were a number of Poles after World War I and World War II that moved to the US. A lot of them ended up near the sugar factory, and I'm imagining they're probably working there. And that's something I'm kind of looking into, but that's yet another kind of interesting twist or way in which we can begin to look at this work. So when leaving, there's a sign encouraging viewers to post photos of the Sphinx online. And when I first saw these photos, I was kind of like depressed, because I thought, oh gosh, these are kind of re-inscribing all the sort of sexist and racist issues that are trying to be sort of unraveled in the work on some level. What was interesting was that Walker was quite aware that this might happen. She, in fact, you might say, goaded the visitor to post things like this. And I'll go one step further to say that what she might have done is sort of inadvertently at least created a contemporary, live flesh tableau of the kinds of work she's usually known as doing. She's usually known to create works in silhouette. The silhouettes are often very much about sort of the colonial moment and the intersection of race and sexuality and gender, these sort of horrible moments. But she's kind of taken that with these photos. I feel like she's taking it from the moment, in the past to now, right? And brings us to a whole new conversation on the contemporary sort of racist situation in the US. So once again, another kind of entanglement, another way of reading or looking at this that brings us across time, right? And this is one I found yesterday that was kind of like, So I'm bringing these three artworks together to begin to understand the entanglements of the past and present of the cities of Manchester, Warsaw, and Brooklyn, specifically the effects of wars and sugar textile trading on the often forced movements of people from and to these locations, as well as the attendant racism, xenophobia, misogyny, and homophobia that accompanied that. The readings are personal, right, and they're deeply connected to my own entanglements with these sites. Yet I want to make clear that all of the readings emerge from the forms of the artworks and my sort of embodied engagement with them. That is, rather than see the artworks as things to be instrumentalized, I'm trying to honor the complex way they operate by working with them to go someplace else that I didn't anticipate I'd go, and I'm sure the artist didn't as well. All to kind of avoid reducing the work to a very singular meaning. I'm going to end there, but just say that next time I'll be speaking about equally happy events like 9/11, 7/7, and the death of Trayvon Martin. But please come anyway. I promised myself the next project I do will be on Giorgio Morandi's still lifes. I need something different. But I'll stop there. Thanks so much for listening.